Hello beautiful friends, welcome to my channel. I'm really glad you're here. Today's video is about identity politics, and there is a lot to say about identity politics. A lot that has already been said, and a lot of conflicting things to be said. The reality is that untangling a political system that doesn't work for most of us, but which is constantly forcing us to reassert labels and categories of identity in order for our needs to even be heard, is, well, one of the more cruel aspects of this hyper-individualistic, capitalist-driven socioeconomic structure. And untangling these things takes far more nuance and time and patience than any YouTube video or book or PhD dissertation can provide. The relationship between personal and political needs is somewhat unfathomably layered, which is not to say that it doesn't deserve our attention, consideration, and mindfulness, or that we can't speak about matters of politics or identity in ways that are helpful or harmful. It just means that while I always encourage you to grind against the things I say, to do your own research, stay curious, and engage more, I encourage that even more today than usual. This video will just be the slightest drop in the ocean of the tangled situation in which we find ourselves. But my hope is that it can get you thinking more critically and paying more attention to how people talk about identity or political coalition in ways that are often too reductive, or which misunderstand what I believe should be our shared goal of creating a society which is more equitable for all people. And at the end of this video, I'll leave you with a meditative phrase to help turn your attention to the substance of people's lives, rather than the boxes they are often placed in. So in my last video, I critiqued the idea of nationalism on the basis that there is in fact very little about living in America that actually assures we share anything in common with other people living in America. Our experiences are incredibly disparate, sometimes more than we can reasonably comprehend. Jeff Bezos and I may indeed both be American, but the amount of our lives that we have in common is laughably small. In other words, the shared identity of American does not really mean much of anything, at least not anything substantive. And the same is true for almost every facet of identity. While certain socio-political categories might make a person more or less likely to experience the world in a certain way, or share certain daily experiences, we cannot trust identity categories as a reliable indicator of shared reality. And beyond that, simply having certain experiences does not assuredly mean that you will understand those experiences in a certain way. There are many women who do not recognize sexism and misogyny in their lives. There are many Black people who deny the realities of racism and white supremacy. There are many gay people who hold incredibly regressive and harmfully normative ideas about sex and sexuality. It is important to remember that the categories are all socially constructed. They only make sense within a social order where we feel a need to categorize people in different ways. This is not to suggest that a kind of race-blind or gender-blind politics is the answer. Just because these categories are socially constructed does not mean that they are not also incredibly real and consequential. It just means that they exist because we fail to close the gaps, to assess reality as reality, to provide equity where there is injustice, and that our ultimate goal in all of these things is liberation, to actually live in a world where the categories of identity are not indicators of a person's worth. In other words, we are not seeking trans rights so much as the ability for all people to express and identify in ways that feel best to them. We are not seeking gay rights so much as the ability for all people to safely and freely explore their sexuality as long as it is between consenting adults. We are not seeking Black rights so much as we are seeking an end to discrimination, violence, imprisonment, and stigmatization on the basis of skin color. We are not seeking rights for poor people so much as we are seeking an end to wealth inequality and the assurance that all people are granted safety and dignity. In other words, we are not seeking an advancement of rights so much as we are striving to eliminate the forces of injustice that require us to mobilize around inequity in the first place. But for now, these categories of identity are very real and very dangerous, which means we often have to engage with them as fights for our rights, knowing that liberation for all people is what we actually are fighting for. Unfortunately, these categories of identity that we often mobilize around have a tendency to be somewhat unreliable. Perhaps the easiest way for me to make this clear is to speak about it in terms of my own transness, as this is the identity category which I am often most placed in. I've already created a video which explores how our current socio-political system converts gender diversity into transness as a facet of identity, and if you haven't seen it yet, I encourage you to give it a watch. But for now, let's compare my transness to that of some other trans people. So my relationship to transness came about because I needed a way to clearly and concisely describe the fact that the options that were available to me within American masculinity were not going to allow for my own survival. I felt trapped by other people's expectations, and the range of things that I was socially allowed to wear, feel, or engage with were too restricting and narrow. I never felt like a woman trapped in a man's body, and in fact, I really struggled with how foreign and uncomfy femininity felt to me at first, which is something I felt a lot of guilt about until I realized that there are a lot of non-trans women who didn't or don't feel quite comfy in femininity all the time either. And while I tried for several years to just challenge people's expectations and create more space for myself, it became increasingly clear that until I changed the performance of my gender, I would not be permitted the social space I needed to be and explore myself. It is not as if femininity always holds enough space for me either. So when people assume that I am female, it still feels like a flat or narrow assumption, but it's one I can work with, one I can survive under. So I changed my name, changed my pronouns, and got on hormones. Not necessarily so that I could become my true self or such Hallmark card nonsense, but just so that other people would stop projecting as much shit onto me that wasn't true. It was a necessary move for my own survival, more than something I needed to fix within myself. And as for whether or not I still would have felt this way if I had been born with different genitals or chromosomes, who the fuck cares? That didn't happen. And maybe I would have been comfy enough then, or maybe I would have still felt trapped by all the assumptions and expectations that go along with femininity. It's honestly surprising to me that anyone can grow up within the narrowness of gender norms and not feel immensely dysphoric. But let's compare my relationship to transness to that of Joey Soloway, the creator of the ever-controversial television show Transparent, which went under primarily because Soloway cast Jeffrey Tambor, a cisgender man, in the main role as the trans parent, only for him to later sexually assault some of the trans members of the cast. I could make a whole series of videos on my feelings about Soloway or Transparent, but for now, I just want to consider a quote from their coming out as non-binary, where they described the experience as, quote, perfect. It feels like a perfect suit to put on. They often speak about their gender in this way, as this liberatory revelation of an identity which grants them greater authority, power, and possibility. And while there are certainly ways in which my own transness can feel empowering, I am not a wealthy LA queer, and my transness has, materially speaking, cost me a great deal more than it has ever given me. And I would never describe my experience with femininity as a perfect suit to put on. Let's consider also Jonathan Van Ness, someone who has continued to gain fame primarily from Netflix's Queer Eye reboot. Van Ness came out in conjunction with an Essie nail sponsorship as part of an advertisement campaign, and who describes their coming out as non-binary by saying, quote, I always used to think, oh, I'm like a gay man, but I think any way I can let little boys and little girls know that they can express themselves and can be making iconic partnerships with brands like Essie, no matter how they present, is really important and exciting. But unlike Van Ness, I was not given a large sum of money for my coming out as non-binary, but instead received some serious judgment from the people around me and a tremendous loss of employment potential. Or we could even briefly consider Caitlyn Jenner, one of the most famous trans people in the world, who has a net worth of about $100 million and who supported Trump in his election. Now, there are a lot of trans people I know who would simply like to deny these people their transness, to call into question the sincerity of their transness, or hold them at an arm's distance, because the ways in which they speak about gender identity really do not reflect, and in fact, cause some serious harm to the ways in which others of us are risking or sacrificing a lot of our comfort and safety for the sake of our gender. I really understand these impulses, and am personally bothered and offended when people compare me to figures like these folks, because no, I am not trans like Caitlyn Jenner, or Joey Soloway, or Jonathan Van Ness. We may be using similar words to describe ourselves, but we did not really create these labels ourselves. They were assigned and decided collectively by a society that pushes anyone who challenges normative gender scripts to become labeled or identified in a certain kind of way. But I think that rather than trying to reinforce gatekeeping on who is or is not trans or non-binary, we should allow these examples to be a reminder that simply because someone fits in the same political identity category as you does not mean that there is much of anything you actually share in common with them, or that their political needs reflect your own. This is another reason that intersectional justice must be central to our political concerns. Joey Soloway, Jonathan Van Ness, and Caitlyn Jenner are all wealthy celebrities, and their experience of and relationship to transness is altered by their position to social and financial capital. When people talk about centering marginalized people, we must actually be considering marginalized people, not people who are incredibly integrated into the fabric and function of society, but who happen to share identity markers which, if held by someone who is poor or black or not famous, might cause them to struggle. There are countless examples of people like this: Ellen DeGeneres, Oprah Winfrey, RuPaul, Condoleezza Rice. I'm not trying to lump all of these individuals together or suggest that all of their politics are equally harmful. I'm simply trying to call attention to the ways in which inhabiting a so-called marginalized facet of identity does not in fact mean you are a marginalized person. And even while these people might have earned more or been more successful if they had been white, straight, non-trans, able-bodied men, it does not mean that they can accurately understand or represent the experiences of those who are put in the same identity category as they are. Celebrity and wealth make these examples more extreme cases, but these same principles are in play in more subtle ways. Let's consider the idea of the LGBTQ+ community, or the idea that simply being queer, however defined, places you in a category of shared political needs. But the needs of gay men are not the same as the needs of lesbian women. And indeed, queer history is marked with a lot of erasure and oppression for lesbians as compared to gay men because of the double bind of homophobia and misogyny. Meanwhile, while same-sex marriage was hailed as a victory for the LGBTQ+ community, in many ways, it only widened the circle of normativity the slightest bit. So now there are gay couples who can live middle or upper class lives and adopt kids, but same-sex marriage did very little to help anyone in the LGBTQ+ community whose political needs go beyond the concerns reflected by the labels of gay or lesbian. And we can consider subsets within this. The needs of transmasculine folks are not the same as the needs of transfeminine folks. The needs of poly individuals are not the same as the needs of asexual people. And I'm not suggesting that we should farther parse apart our factions or divide ourselves or our political efforts. Quite the opposite. I believe that we need to stop pretending as if holding some facet of identity indicates a posture of shared needs, alliance, or allyship. It may have been that my queerness, my abnormal sexuality or gender variance, was the thing that opened my eyes to how the status quo is failing. But my political fight is no longer exclusively in service of my own needs, but is in service of the collective needs of all people experiencing injustice. And all of us have experienced injustice in some way or another. We know what it feels like to be treated wrongly, and we can relate to that feeling as a catalyst for the ethical imperative to end the suffering of others, regardless of what identity markers we do or do not hold. I'm not downplaying the role of privilege, nor suggesting that we speak on behalf of one another or experiences that we do not have. But I am suggesting that even if you are one of the most marginalized people, if your fight for justice is strictly self-centered, if it begins and ends with your own needs and does not extend outward to include compassion for all people, all beings, it will not provide the sustainability needed to create a more equitable society. Power can be upended and tables turned, but until we begin to collectively undo our allegiance to self-interest and work to eliminate the substance of oppressive forces and tendencies, power will just change hands. We will end one form of injustice only to enact another. And to you, dear listener, whoever you are, I care more about your heart, your actions, your accountability to the people around you than I do your political labels. These labels are not enough to indicate what we actually have in common. They often only just divide us and paralyze us more. I know straight white men who fight harder for intersectional justice than some of the most marginalized people, because a commitment to justice is about a certain kind of posture and a certain way of life, more than it is about a certain experience or facet of identity. But unfortunately, there are an increasing number of straight white men being pushed toward the alt-right because they do not understand what their role in the fight for justice can be. We cannot change the aspects of ourselves that assign us these identities, but we can change the frame in which we understand them. And speaking candidly, if we are going to rally around identity politics, let's at least speak a great deal more about class solidarity. There is almost no facet of identity which prevents an individual from becoming disproportionately privileged once they inhabit a position of wealth. And many of the greatest dangers and injustices afflicting marginalized communities could be seriously alleviated, if not eliminated, with a more equitable economic system, one in which healthcare, education, access to safe housing, healthy food, and clean water were available to all. And for the first time in human history, this is a question of distribution more than one of resources. We are producing enough to sustainably provide for all people. We are simply not distributing it equitably. But at the core of identity-based pleas for justice is a plea for worth and dignity. And it does not do a person any good to have their pronouns respected if they do not know where their next meal is coming from, or to hire more Black people only to pay them an unlivable wage. Building political coalition in this way begins with us speaking more candidly and clearly about our own experiences with injustice, and in turn listening to the experiences of those around us and working to eliminate suffering and injustice for us all. We need to find those things that we actually hold in common, rather than relying on identity markers and political categories to offer us strength or coalition. I have been hung out to dry by plenty of queer people, while some of the most privileged populations have shown up for me in moments where I really needed it. In the same way that we must move past the normative labels of citizenship and nationalism, we must learn to build coalition around shared ideology, sincere accountability, and tangible action. We need to become less concerned with who people are, their labels or social position, and more concerned with how they live, what they demonstrate their values to be, and how they show up for people around them. Our identities are socially constructed, consequences of an already unjust socio-political system. But our actions, the way we live, the way we fight for and protect the people around us as well as ourselves, marks the collective path that will lead us to more sustainable and equitable futures. So I'll leave you with a meditative phrase, one you can connect to your breath, to help remind you to focus less on who people are and more on how people live. And it goes like this. So on the inhale, think to yourself, no matter our identities. And on the exhale, our actions reflect our values. No matter our identities, our actions reflect our values. No matter our identities, our actions reflect our values. If you're feeling brave and vulnerable enough to share any response you had to today's reflection, I would love to hear from you in the comments. And if you enjoyed today's video or it meant something to you, please like and subscribe. Your support means a great deal to me as I want to provide reflections which speak to you. And thank you for watching. I wish you peace and perspective. I love you all as I love myself, as we are part of the same world, and I look forward to talking with you again soon.